Move along. Very nice to welcome you all, and so they come. This is on will robots take your job, and I think the answer is perhaps. Any questions? I've got into this discussion over the last few years rather sideways. I mean, my basic focus over the years has been on bioethics, but increasingly moving into a discussion of the social and policy aspects of emerging technologies. And I had the privilege a couple of years ago of having a Fulbright, if you know what that is. I went to the University of Ottawa for 6 months with a visiting chair in science and society, specifically looking at issues of the impact of technology on labour markets, and had some interesting meetings with people in the Federal Ministry of Labour in Canada, and discussions of the impact in their particular economy of these developments. And so, I mean, I've had an opportunity to address these issues as someone who is not a technologist, not a roboticist, not a labour market economist either, but it's amazing what you can get away with. I, for example, the Economist, The Economist flew me to Hong Kong to give the keynote at their Asia Investors Summit, when I said, perhaps at a rather more length in response to this question. And so, I've been involved in these conversations, and it's interested me that it's all about questions, it's not about answers. But as I was saying earlier, public authorities and even trade unions, which really does surprise me, seem very reluctant to engage in this conversation, let alone to take any decisions based on some sort of risk analysis. If you've seen my, I've got these two books, that the one with all the nice pictures that CARE published, which is written, from broadly from a Christian perspective. But I also have this little red book that Polity Press asked me to write, specifically on the jobs issue. And the best thing about that book is the quote on the back from Tom Standage, who is deputy editor of The Economist, where he says that I have a refreshing approach to this question. We don't know, but that's the problem. And he neatly sums up my book, and it means that he's probably even read it, which people don't always do when they write blurbs, and we don't know. And so the approach I have taken is that, you draw a risk matrix. The impact of the end of the full employment economy is unquantifiable in its awfulness for developed and also for developing economies. And there is a non-trivial chance, and this is essentially the conclusion of my various researches and conversations over the last 5 or 6 years in this field, there is a non-trivial chance that there will be long-term impacts on labour markets of these technology developments, which will not be reversible. I hosted a teleconference in Washington at the think tank where I worked for the last 10 years, until about a year ago, on these questions, I think about 4 years ago, with a senior US government economist and several other participants, one of whom was a man with one of the most wonderful names I've come across, called Marshall Brain. And Marshall Brain is a smart fellow. He founded the website How Stuff Works, which is still out there, and he sold it at the right time. And although he still teaches computer science in a university and writes and so on, I suspect he's not worrying how to pay his mortgage. And Marshall Brain has written a couple of little books on this subject. And I actually heard him speak at one of these big singularity conferences hosted by Ray Kurzweil, who's the great guru of the singularity, coming next week, and it'll all be wonderful. And he had Marshall speak at this event. And what Marshall did, and this is probably going back 10 years, he put up a slide. It was my first introduction specifically to the employment issues. He put up a slide. I live in the States, and there's a one-page version of all the jobs you can be doing that you fill out for various tax purposes. The US Department of Labor has a job classification of, I think it is 901 different jobs, if I remember rightly. And they boil it down to a one-page version for certain purposes. And he put up this as a slide, and he just went through all these jobs. And this yes, this no, this yes, this no, and he said 50%, in 25 years' time. And he was booed and hissed by this audience of singularity, cultists. And I caught him afterwards and he was a bit upset about this whole thing, I think, and I went for a walk with him and got to know him a bit. So we then had him on this teleconference, and it was very interesting, one of his answers, because, we had maybe 100 people on the call from various points of the country and points of view, and the two key people on the call were, the three people on the call were Marshall Brain, the chief economist of the Small Business Administration, and a representative of AFL-CIO, which is the American version of the TUC, whom I had got with great difficulty to take part in this conversation, considerable difficulty. They did not want to be drawn. And the AFL-CIO guy was saying, don't worry, don't worry, don't worry, the labour movement loves innovation, we're all pro-technology. And I said things like, well, the Teamsters, the most powerful of the American private sector unions, the lorry drivers, I said, what if they end up with no members in 20 years' time or 15 years' time because of the automation of trucks? And it'll self-driving it's going to begin with goods vehicles because they're so much more expensive. And you can get 24-hour operation out of them, and the insurance is so high, and they cause so many accidents and so on. I said, what if the Teamsters have no members in 20 years' time? And he just pooed. And he said, anyway, innovation always creates new jobs, new and more valuable jobs. And Marshall Brain said, yes, and they will be done by robots. and Brain's whole point, and it was a very specific argument, was that because of the exponential nature of the technology driving these changes, it's a race that we're going to lose. Because any attempt to create new jobs or preserve jobs in field after field will go to pot. Another story which helped shape my thinking, some of you will know the name of Larry Summers, who's the former US Treasury Secretary, rather ebullient character, who is famously portrayed in the Social Network movie, and he was president of Harvard when Zuckerberg was there. And Larry Summers he's a very outspoken man, and he gave a very interesting lecture. Keynes has this essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Children, in which he raises the possibility of technological unemployment. And it's a great read if you can just dig it out on the internet. And Summers was asked to give a lecture in Washington, I think it was about 4 years ago, and he called it Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in the lecture he says, very interesting, that he basically changed his mind. He said, when I was a student at MIT, back in the, I suppose, 70s or so, he's sort of my age, he said there were basically two groups discussing these things. There were the economic students and so on who were all everything was going to be wonderful. And then there were mainly non-economic students who were, he said, the stupid Luddite people. That was his phrase, sort of, the stupid Luddite people. And he says, I now think the stupid Luddite people may have been right. And what I think we've seen is a series of individuals, like Summers, have changed their mind and have realized that there's a non-trivial possibility of long-term disruption in labor markets caused by these developments in automation. Another example, other end of the spectrum, interestingly, is Charles Murray, who is a rather controversial conservative intellectual in the States. Much admired, but regarded by more progressive voices as being well, they'd accuse him of racism and so on and so forth, which I think is probably unfair given his own position. But he wrote the Bell Curve, which is all about intelligence and race and so on. But Murray has now, in the Wall Street Journal of all places, from a lecture given at the American Enterprise Institute, which is the big, enterprise institute in Washington, Murray now says that he's in favor of universal basic income. And he says in 20 years' time or something, it's very hard to believe that we will have the same pattern of people having jobs and careers and so on full-time, for their working lives that we have now. And we're going to have to find some other way to shape the economy. And of course, as you may know, the basic income idea, which I am not an enthusiast for, but it comes from Milton Friedman. And it was conceived as a very conservative way of analyzing the way in which we should reorganize all of the gazillions of benefits, transfers, which we have in developed economies. a much more rational way, which is simply basically divvy them all up so that most people get the same thing. And of course, this then helps create demand in the economy, and there are all sorts of benefits to it. So this is basically a conservative idea, which now the left is now largely enthusing about. And you may have seen the report from the RSA, Matthew Taylor and co. produced a couple of years ago. I'm not an enthusiast for basic income, and I'll just make a couple of comments about this because it's something I didn't address earlier. Partly because, well, there are two versions of it. The conservative version of it divvies up all the benefits, and it means that all the interest groups of people who have special benefits are going to be up in arms about it and will make it impossible to get it through politically anyway. And of course, it does mean that, you know, people who are blind and people who can't walk and all sorts of people who get special benefits, they're taken away to be divided up so everybody gets some. So whether you're going to pay everybody $1,000 a month or whatever it is, that's how you get it. From a conservative point of view, it doesn't cost you any more money, but it does cost you a lot of political pain. From, if you like, the progressive point of view, which is the RSA version here in the UK, it costs you new money because you preserve most of these benefits and you find more money to divvy up. And in the age of austerity, which of course is very much the British moment, that also impossible. I've actually written an article about this for Unheard, for the website that I write for, saying, in fact, what we need is a creative approach to varying retirement ages, led by state pension and also by the various ways in which the state can influence pension policy, private pensions policies, so that what government can do, if we see a decline in employment, and certainly we've already seen a decline in labour market participation by men, which is a much more useful indicator here than actual unemployment statistics are. But government should use retirement age as a sort of governor of the amount of employment available in the economy. As a number of people in the economy available to be employed. And use it correctly. Now, I think it's absolutely absurd that every government in the Western world has been pushing up retirement ages. I think it's completely ridiculous. I think if any party wants to get elected by a landslide, they'll pull it down. And they'll start by pulling women's retirement age down to where it was the one advantage women had in the economy. And it's been taken away from them in the interest of fairness to men. I'm just surprised there haven't been huge protests about this, as women's retirement, state pension ages have been being pushed up in Britain to match men's, and men's are being pushed up further. And I think this is completely absurd because the number of jobs available, any smart person can see there's a big chance at least there will be fewer jobs available, even if there isn't the kind of collapse that could take place. So I think that's a partial solution. One final comment, and then Dave can respond, and then we can get some discussion going. I'm intrigued by the fact that even trade unions regard this as too hot a potato to pick up. I think it's very interesting. It says something about the kind of consensus mentality which crosses the political spectrum in country after country after country, when there's serious evidence in another direction. Nobody wants to be accused of being a Luddite. You know, it's very like fundamentalist. It's a sort of the equivalent of fundamentalist in the technology world, and nobody wants to be put in a position of having to propose changes and initiatives and so on, which are going to have high cost and yet only have long-term benefits, high political cost. And I think this is what democratic governments, at least, do not want to have to take hard decisions now, reshaping social policy and so on. Now, I was invited to a meeting in 10 Downing Street 2 or 3 years ago to talk to some of the SPADs about this. And I said, look, there's no obvious sort of solution in my pocket, but what we need to start by doing is analysing every policy that discriminates on the basis of employment and looking at ways to equalise the employment-unemployment situation. So where we deal with voluntary sector, retirement, non-retirement, student, non-student, part-time, full-time, gig, self-employed, employed. Every one of these distinctions should be re-evaluated in light of scenarios in which there's a significantly smaller supply of employment available. So, I mean, there are practical things that can be done that I think are not costly. But I think I'll stop there and let Dave respond.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Can you understand me? I speak a different form of English than Nigel, as you'll come to understand.
Okay.
I thought I'd preface this. I'm just going to follow on a little bit with more questions and then we'll open it up for some interaction and stuff. But I wanted to start by saying I know nothing. I am not an expert at all in these fields. My academic background is in political philosophy and what's called policy sociology. And I work for the Evangelical Alliance and we do the public policy work in the UK. So we see how this affects different areas of policy. But I've got a general interest in terms of how Christians transform society and renew things, and a specific interest in employment. You know, what Christianity brings to the whole world of work. It's always been an interest of mine. I don't really know why. And I was really alerted to this whole area when I was at a conference in New York a few years ago and it was about transforming cities and nations. And I went off to a small side group like this on business, which is a bit bigger in the Marriott. Americans always do things bigger. And they had a panel of blue chip directors from blue chip companies, Chase Manhattan Bank, etc., etc. And they were rattling on about public theology and how they bring their faith to work. And then one of them made a throwaway comment that we think, well, we all know that 42% of the American workforce will be replaced by robotics and automation in the next 22 years. And the rest of the panel just sort of nodded along and accepted this as written. I nearly fell off my chair. The biggest economy on earth, the engine for the entire global economy. If that was even half right, it would represent a quadrupling of the effects of the Industrial Revolution in a nanosecond. So that started me thinking into this area. And what I want to do is just stimulate more questions and focus our discussion on what's the response of Christians to this, the church, and particularly in the UK, but more further afield. And I come up with this. I was thinking, how do we map where people are generally on this? And I come up with this brilliant quadrilateral taxonomy, which it's based on the England flag, because I thought we would have won the Belgium game last night, but there you go. Luddite. At one end of the scale, we've got people who just see technology as a bad thing and would like to go back to farming and living on a hill in Wales. And there is a big movement against technology out there, which is quite neo-pagan in its form. And then futurists, people who just embrace it all because it's all good, isn't it? And we've heard these today from Nigel and John. And at the other end of the scale here, we've got people who are really stressed about this, who are worried about it and see how it applies and impacts their world. And then we've got people who are just not bothered, you know, blissfully unaware, don't care, not bothered. And I think people kind of are moving around on this as technology stories are coming through and filtering through. But I was trying to locate myself on all of this. I'm probably between futurist and really stressed, somewhere in that area there. And I guess we're all bothered. That's why we're here today. So we should be slightly stressed. Nigel's mapped out some big questions that this raises for us all, relating to the possible scale of change and the pace of change, and the nature and impact of change, the degree to which it will bring either job displacement or job dissolution, the dissolution of work. And it's helpful this entire day today because it gives us a bandwidth, I think, or it should do by the end of the day, within which we can think what might be possible or potential. So think of some questions you're going to ask Nigel later. But what it also gives us, I think, is, talking from a sociological perspective, is it helps us think about the variables, the things, what is it, the known unknowns. Who was Donald Rumsfeld, wasn't it? The unknown knowns and the known unknowns. Things like the social effects of the technologies combining and connecting together. We can talk about technologies in isolation from each other, but what happens when the bioengineering technologies connect across with all these other technologies and the nanotechnologies? We've got no really way of knowing what that's going to look like, but I've seen some stuff around the military application of these things that is absolutely terrifying, exciting and terrifying. And then you've got the political reactions to what's called structural unemployment. And John Cruddas is going to touch on this stuff this afternoon. You know, those left behind by so-called